So now we move to the first keynote lecture, and I'm honored to introduce the lecturer, Professor Amelia Glaser from the University of California in San Diego. Amelia is in my opinion, is the leading expert in Jewish literature in Yiddish. So I'm very pleased to welcome you, Amelia. Please take your seat and
thank you.
Let us start this part.
Okay. Thank you so much, Vitaly, for including me in this really exciting conference. Those of you who are in Ukraine, I will speak in English. I hope that's okay with everyone. But if people have questions, Russian, Yiddish, no problem whatsoever. Ukrainian, go ahead, and if I misunderstand something in Ukrainian, people will help. I'm so honored to be included in this conference and to have been invited to share my thoughts for the keynote. Those of you who are living in Ukraine are so fortunate to have Vitaly working in the field of Jewish studies, such a really wonderfully passionate scholar, but also really thoughtful individual in the way that pulling things together and making Jewish studies a reality, together with Ukrainian studies, I believe, which is incredibly important. I have a dedication to this talk. I learned yesterday that my colleague David Goodblatt from UC San Diego was fatally injured in a car accident, and he's a professor emeritus of ancient Jewish history. I've learned much from him, and it felt like a small gesture, but I wanted to dedicate this talk that I'm giving for you today to Professor David Goodblatt. A couple of his books here, Elements of Ancient Jewish Nationalism and The Monarchic Principle, Studies in Jewish Government and Antiquity. So that's the sort of just before I get started. So it's really an honor to be here. Actually, I may sit. I'll be dancing between my notes and my PowerPoint. I first visited Odessa exactly 20 years ago. It was September of 1999. It was really in the last century. Yes, it was September of 1999, and I met a good friend, a fellow Yiddishist in Kyiv. We together took regional trains south, stopping in various cities on our way to Odessa. And neither of us knew what we were doing. We were sort of self-guided heritage tourists, relying on our Yiddish and Russian to get around and try to learn something from the people that we met. And we arrived one morning in the city of Khmelnytsky, and my friend, with sort of his characteristic kind of British irony, insisted that we daven Shacharis, that we say the morning prayers, standing in front of the statue to Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And sure, why not? It was dawn. It's a beautiful thing. It's a mitzvah to daven Shacharis at dawn. I'm not going to claim to be someone who usually daven Shacharis, especially at dawn. But we did this. We stood here in front of the statue of Khmelnytsky, and this is a figure who in Jewish history is usually named, followed by the phrase, "May his name be blotted out." So this was this moment of a kind of recognition for me as a young, early graduate student. I was about to start a Yiddish master's degree at Oxford, of competing legacies, conflicting legacies. On the same trip, we then arrived in Medjugorje, the place, the burial site of the Baal Shem Tov, and we were sort of walking around Medjugorje asking people if there might be any Yiddish speakers still hanging out in the city. This was something a person could plausibly do in 1999. And I came upon a couple of men, a couple of elderly Ukrainian men sitting on a bench. And one of them said to me, I was in a camp too. Don't you want to hear my story? And it took me by surprise a little bit. It was quite confrontational, and we were there as Yiddishists, but I did want to hear his story. And we talked for a little while, but more than that, I came to this realization that this was a place that was, in a sense, paradigmatic of conflicting stories, conflicting narratives, and most importantly, conflicting cultural pain. When we arrived in Odessa on this trip, we met a few Yiddish speakers. We had this fantasy that we might find, I don't know, a group of Yiddish poets or something hanging out smoking cigarettes, and we didn't, but we found these elderly Yiddish speakers on University of hanging out in front of the synagogue, and this is Esther Chassid, who was a, convinced Zionist. She was studying Hebrew at the Gemilas Chesed. We ended up writing a story about her for the forwards in Yiddish. And a year later, a friend of ours returned. I actually came with her to make a film about her. And we met her friend Tanya Krivoruchka, who was still a devout communist. And we sat with the two of them in Esther's house, watching them argue in Yiddish about ideology. So again, I associate with Odessa and with Ukraine in general a place of fruitful, productive conflict. So since this first encounter with the Ukrainian landscape in 1999 for me, the relationship between Jews and Ukrainians, and especially Jewish and Ukrainian literature, two traditions that came of age side by side in the Tsarist Empire, has become a kind of paradigm, a means to answering this fundamental question. How can literature help us translate trauma? And this is a question that I am trying to consider in work that goes beyond Ukraine and beyond Yiddish literature. I'm a scholar of comparative literature, working in a department of literature with a capital L. So how do we translate trauma rather than simply compare it? How do we understand how people have attempted to understand one another or not attempted to understand one another? Or as my colleague in the United States at the University of Urbana-Champaign in Illinois, Harriet Murov, has put it in her discussion of Peretz Markish, where indeed is the boundary between pain and pain? More specifically, how have writers attempted to understand or have resisted understanding other groups of people with whom they have long cohabitated, with whom they have shared periods of mistrust and animosity? So in the brief time that I have today, I want to argue that this contact zone, this Ukrainian contact zone, to borrow a term from Mary Louise Pratt, has had this important influence on Jewish writers beyond Ukraine and how they grapple with this more general question of coexistence. And you will notice that the title is a slightly stretched out, elongated title from what you have in your program. Rather than simply focusing on the Age of Internationalism, as I call it, I'm calling my talk for you Yiddish Literature in Ukraine from the Haskalah to the Age of Internationalism. So I'll try to give a little bit of a long durée, sharing with you a little bit of my own development as a scholar working in comparative literature with Ukrainian and Jewish texts, and how this question of coexistence has developed in my own work. I'll first offer a very quick look at the rise of Yiddish literature in Ukraine, based on these very rudimentary depictions of Ukrainians in early Yiddish works, especially the Haskalah and the sort of immediate post-Haskalah. I'll then turn to literature that treated violence in Ukraine, specifically pogroms, and finally I'll turn to what I have called the Age of Internationalism, a period when Jewish poets came to metabolize the uncomfortable coexistence of non-Jews, or with non-Jews, in the Pale of Settlement. And this is the poetry that was written in what I've decided to frame as the long 1930s in the Soviet Union and among Soviet-identified writers. So, here I'll move to the next slide. I've come to view the Pale of Settlement, and especially the Ukrainian regions of the Pale of Settlement, where Jews were confined to live between roughly 1791 and 1917. Obviously, the borders were redrawn a couple of times as a case study in literary dialogues between coexisting groups. And in this case, between three groups in particular. There were more, but I'm focusing on three in this: Russian, Ukrainian, and Yiddish, and specifically Jewish. These groups did not always live in harmony, but the stories they wrote offer a case study in literary intersections. Coexistence in this period didn't involve a lot of empathy. This is something that my colleague Myroslav Shkandrij has also written about extensively from the Ukrainian angle. It was, the Jews in Kondratevsky, Gogol, and Kvitka are one-dimensional, and so are the Ukrainians that emerge in Yiddish literature at this point in Oxenfeld, Mendeley, Shalom Aleichem. And yet I've come to view the stories of what I called 19th century the Ukrainian commercial landscape, these multi-ethnic markets and fairs in the territory, the Ukrainian regions of the Pale of Settlement, as a close-knit model for world literature, a place where characters within different and sometimes antagonistic backgrounds could look sidelong at one another and borrow from one another. Modern Yiddish literature, I argued in my first monograph, Jews and Ukrainians in Russia's Literary Borderlands, that modern Yiddish literature emerged from under Gogol's coat, but not the shinel that Akaky Akakievich wore in the overcoat, but the Krasnaya Svitka that the devil wore in the Sorochintsy fair. So all of these literatures were grappling in some sense with this vortex of sorts of Russian literature, of Malorossiyskaya literatura. So I just put a few of these key figures up here on the slide for entertainment. So I came to view the close development of modern Slavic and Jewish comic literature, comic prose, in the case of that first book project, as a model for transnationalism. Hopefully you can read the slides. This is a map that I really like. Beehive Mapping did this for me for this first book project, and they've allowed me to publish it wherever I want, so you can steal it if you want to. It's, this is the current, more or less current map of Ukraine, and of course the Pale of Settlement, and I've highlighted a few key places where these market exchanges and literary exchanges took place. So a few years before, Gogol depicted his own multi-ethnic landscape in a commercial landscape in Ukraine, complete with scheming Jews. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe had generated his own theory of world literature, or Weltliteratur, which envisions world literature as a network. Quote, traffic in ideas between peoples, a literary market to which the nations bring their intellectual treasures for exchange. And Gogol, with his fair, the ethnically Ukrainian Gogol, was doing exactly that. He was presenting the literary goods from Ukraine as a kind of product, fresh from his own backyard, in a language that his Petersburg readers would understand. St. Petersburg, of course, then was the center of Russia's literary economy. It was a 19th century Russian analog to Pascale Casanova's Parisian World Republic of Letters, a geography which, to quote Casanova, is based on the opposition between a capital and peripheral dependencies whose relationship to this center is defined by their aesthetic difference and distance from it. So Gogol's commercial Ukrainian landscape as a peripheral challenge to this Petersburg center becomes consecrated, again to borrow Casanova's term, on the Petersburg publishing market, even as it reinforces early 19th century anxieties about the empire's borderlands. If, as Benedict Anderson has observed, pre-modern states, quote, were defined by their centers, borders were porous and indistinct, and sovereignties faded imperceptibly into one another. Modern empires strove for consolidated lands, and by the time of the 1830-31 Polish uprising, the Tsarist government was acutely aware of the risks of its multi-ethnic borderlands. The Ukrainian territories, called, of course, Little Russia or Malorossiya, in contrast to the greater Russian region of Eurasia, overlapped with the Jewish Pale of Settlement, much of which Catherine had annexed from Poland in the 18th century. So the markets and fairs in this region, where Jews, Ukrainians, Russians, and Poles, among other groups, met and exchanged goods, presented a geographical, cultural, and political counterpoint to the Russian imperial core. They were dangerous due to their porousness. So modern Yiddish literature emerged in part as an imitation of Russian and Ukrainian naturalistic portrayals of life in the Pale of Settlement. it simultaneously offered a corrective to negative Jewish caricatures in Slavic literature, borrowing tropes of disguise and subterfuge at the same time. The early Yiddish writers of the Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment, having abandoned the religious communities in which they were raised, viewed Yiddish not as fodder for folklore, but as a tool for re-educating a Yiddish-speaking readership. So as a case in point, Yisrael Oxenfeld's Das Sterntichel, or the headband, is a text that borrows tropes and devices largely from Gogol. I particularly like this edition that I found on the Yiddish Book Center. It's actually a Soviet edition of Oxenfeld, 1938. Oxenfeld probably wrote this novel in the 1840s, and it wasn't published until the 1860s. But one of the heroes in this novel, Oxman, fools a town's Hasidic followers into thinking he was a great Rebbe, only to reveal their gullibility at the end. And an act, of course, resembling Yakov's unmasking of the mayor's entourage in Gogol's The Inspector General. So Oxenfeld had been born in Nemirov in a Hasidic community. He left the Hasidic community and devoted his life to carefully, through humor, teaching Yiddish readers to make fun, often rather brutally make fun of Hasidim. He eventually made his way to Odessa, where he hung out with other Moslems. The Ukrainian shtetl was a thing for Oxenfeld and his fellow enlighteners to be rejected. And it would later take a more nuanced generation of Yiddish writers to not only respect some of the practices of shtetl Jews, but to begin to depict Ukrainian-Jewish coexistence. Enter Sholem Abramovich, or Bezler Sporim, as his narrator is called, who offers a slightly more sympathetic portrayal of shtetl-dwelling Jews, especially his narrator, Mendeley. He's a free-thinking but unassimilated Jew, employing his own variant on Gogolian skaz. Abramovich offered his readers semi-educated characters, not uneducated characters, not exactly Rudy Planko, who may have been illiterate, but these kind of semi-educated characters who were meant to enlighten the semi-educated but still unmodernized Yiddish readership that they mocked. So we're not just talking about people in Petersburg laughing at Ukrainian peasants, we're talking about Jews laughing at Jews who look a lot like them. A little bit of a twist on skaz. Like Kotlarevsky, who was writing in Ukrainian for fun, Abramovich, who began as a Hebrew writer and then switched to Yiddish, playfully mocked Yiddish when he shifted to the language of the masses, while also raising it to a level of art. Mm-hmm. Early Yiddish writers used Ukrainian-speaking characters in their texts, and even bits of Ukrainian, to increase this sense of a tale told from the backwards provinces, the backward shtetl. So take, for example, the quixotic hero of Abramovich's 1878, The Tales of Benjamin III, Masoes von Binyamin Ashlishi, who, lacking any real navigational skill, wanders in circles, frequently mistaking his native Ukraine for the biblical land of Israel. Lost and hungry, the desperate pilgrim asks a passing peasant for help. He falls asleep in this wagon driver's cart. And he ends up waking up terrified that he's being taken to market to be sold on a slave market. And in an effort to save himself, Benjamin promises the driver, in a mixture of Ukrainian and poor Ukrainian and Yiddish, "In Tunei Divka, my wife will give you some strong spirits and a bit of Sabbath loaf, and will kindly thank you. Utunei Divki Zinka tebe do starke shlish, I Shabushkova bulke, I dobre dziękuję tebe." So the peasant brings Benjamin back to the familiar market of Tunei Divka, and the market goers are very happy to recover their lost neighbor. Abramovich's younger contemporary, Sholem Rabinovich, much better known as Sholem Aleichem, as his nom de plume cast him, also wrote of bewildered shtetl Jews who must heroically navigate the Ukrainian landscape, and in particular Ukrainian market spaces. Most famously in his The Haunted Tailor, the Der Verkischte Schneidevil, the protagonist, and this was written in 1901, the protagonist, Shimon Elia Shema Kolenu, is an ineffectual and henpecked husband who's sent to market, resembling a little bit, I think, Solopy Chedovic from Gogol's Starochinskaya Yarmarka. Having saved just enough money to purchase a milk goat for his wife, Shimon Eli enters Kazadeyevka, goat milking town, with its unfamiliar goat market, to the sounds of market women shouting back and forth at one another in Ukrainian, confusing the gender of the chickens. So the quote that I have for you here, and I apologize that my Ukrainian is transliterated. I transliterated it to Latin characters from the Yiddish. Listen, listen, how much for the hen? What hen? This is a rooster, not a hen. So let it be a rooster. Well, how much for the hen? Czujesz, a що to by za kurkę? Jaka kurka? To pływem, a na kurkę. Nechaj pójdę pływem. A що to by za kurka? So in the end, what brings about the bewitched tailor's downfall isn't these market women. These market women are just decoration. But it's other Jews in his community who first played tricks on him and then set out to wage war on one another when there's a confusion between a billy goat and a nanny goat, and the cousin is swapping the goat out back and forth. So all because of this trick, two Jewish communities wage war on one another. The Ukrainian women are absolutely decoration, and yet they raise the anxiety of the story. The Shulam Aleichem, Mendele, and Atzenfeld were not attempting to write for Ukrainians. They were writing for Jews, whom they hoped to convince to reform or perhaps even abandon shtetl life. And others have rightfully read these texts in the context of Hasidic tales, Hebrew literature, and specifically Jewish comedy, not making particularly much out of the Ukrainian intersections. But what I found in reading this literature together with Russian and Ukrainian prose is that together these literatures do constitute a kind of borderland prose. After all, world literature, to quote David Damrosch, can be read as, I'm quoting here, a mode of circulation and reading. And so too could we read Ukraine's literary intersections as a history of circulation and exchange, whether through translation, travesty, plagiarism, in some cases we have people just ripping off from Gogol or Kotlяревsky, or reception. So the literature of the Yiddish Masculine give a sense of the place of the Ukrainian peasants and the Ukrainian landscape, filtered in part through Slavic literatures in Ukraine. And I want to now turn to a different period in Yiddish literature and in Jewish literature more generally. And this is the period of between the pogroms of the 1880s to World War I, a time when Jewish writers engaged more directly with Ukrainian history. And that's just, I'm very into marketplaces. That's an old picture of the Kharkiv marketplace. The Ukraine that emerges in these early stories that I've just been talking about in Yiddish was a place where Jews were constantly afraid. And Mendele and Shulam Aleichem, as late Maskilic writers, were simultaneously amplifying this fear in their texts and shifting the responsibility from Ukrainians to Jews. When I completed my study of the commercial landscape as a key to understanding the literatures of the Pale of Settlement, I felt compelled to turn from this generative, if dangerous, marketplace landscape to a different aspect of Ukrainian-Jewish coexistence. And again, I was interested in seeing what would happen if I applied a comparative approach to a shared literary landscape. An elephant in the room for, as I saw it, especially for Jews and for Jewish history, was Khmelnytsky. This is a figure who is remembered as a perpetrator of horrific evil in Jewish history and as a hero in Ukrainian history to some extent. And so in pursuit of answers to this question of competing legacies, I managed to convince a dozen absolutely outstanding scholars of Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, and Jewish history and literature to join me in understanding this legacy. And Myroslav was among them, wrote a wonderful article for this book that came out on Khmelnytsky. So the Khmelnytsky uprising against the Polish magnates of the 17th century, I'm sure this is familiar history to everyone in the room, ended in the death of thousands of Jews as collateral damage. This also ended up bringing Russia and Ukraine politically closer through the Pereyaslav Treaty, a mixed blessing, as history has shown. In Jewish literature, The Khmelnytsky episode was first canonized through a series of contemporary texts written in the 1650s, and these stories would reemerge every time there was a renewed episode of anti-Jewish violence in Ukraine. As Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi has noted, quoting, "The pronounced tendency after 1648 to fit the recent catastrophe into the mold of past tragedies reveals a resistance to novelty in history." So if we read through this lens, the Cossack uprising, which the chroniclers already equated with the Crusades, became a kind of war tragedy for Eastern European Jews that could stand in for the pogroms of 1881-82, 1903 to 1905, and then later 1918 to 1920 and beyond. And yet, upon closely scrutinizing modernist Jewish retellings of the Khmelnytsky episode, something surprising emerges. In some cases, the story becomes an allegory for modern religious reconciliation and even tolerance. And I want to briefly share a couple of examples from this. In the 1880s, the Khmelnytsky uprisings were in the air. This is another map, also done by Beehive Mapping, of the Hetmanate and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In the 1880s, the Khmelnytsky episode was very much in the air. Mikeshin's monument to Khmelnytsky was unveiled in Kiev in 1888. This is the model of the monument, which is found in the Russian Museum in Petersburg. The early model, of course, had Jews and Poles being squashed under the feet of Khmelnytsky's horse, and even the Brotherhood of Orthodox Slavic nations in front of him. The pogroms of 1881-82, so the first major incidents of violence against Jews in Ukraine since the times of Khmelnytsky, were still vivid in the minds of Russia's Jews, and the restrictive temporary legislation, the main laws that followed them, were still in effect. So Solomon Kern's Russian translation of Nathan Hanover's 1654 Hebrew chronicle of the Khmelnytsky episodes, Yevon Metzula, or The Vale of Tears, was republished in 1883. Everyone was thinking about Khmelnytsky in the 1880s. And this is just an image of one of the original productions of the Hanover Chronicles. And this is just for fun. In the 1970s, this was a Ukrainian translation that was done that I found in the British Library. So in his Chronicle of Tulchin, Hanover describes a fortified city besieged by Cossack troops, and the Jews and Poles form an alliance. The Cossacks, led by Krivonis, offer to spare the Poles in exchange for the Jews as their property. And the Poles accept. They throw the Jews under the bus, under the avant-la-lettre, right, under the whatever carriage. The Jews, of course, learning of the betrayal, prepare to wage war on their Polish neighbors. But the head of the city's rabbinical academy convinces the Jews to lay down their weapons. Hanover turns this into a story of religious martyrdom in the face of conversion. The Cossacks, once they assemble all of the Jews outside the fortress, declare, "Whoever wishes to change his faith and remain alive, let him sit under this banner." And the banner, of course, represents conversion to Orthodox Christianity. None move, and the community is massacred. The Cossacks then attack the Polish fortress. So in spite, or more likely because of the literary license that Hanover clearly took in writing his own narrative in the 1650s, the narrative appeal of Tulchin led modern writers and historians to repeat Hanover's account. Both Gretz and Dubnov repeat Hanover's description of the Jewish martyrdom at Tulchin almost verbatim. Mykola Kostomarov, too, emphasizes religion in the Cossack uprising over the more probable economic motivations. And for Jewish writers at the turn of the 20th century, the stories seem to mirror contemporary struggles in the territory of Ukraine. In one of his railway stories, Shalom Aleichem, with his characteristic irony, has a community of Jews awaiting the Cossacks from Tulchin, who ostensibly will guard the Jews against a pogrom. Well, in 1888, the Russian writer, Russian language symbolist, Nikolai Maximovich Minsky, a pseudonym for Nikolai Ulenkin, this was a Jew who had converted to Orthodox Christianity, published a play titled Osada Tulchina, The Siege of Tulchin, in St. Petersburg's Jewish journal Voskod. Minsky was born a Jew and had converted, and he creates this invented hero, a Marano, named Castro, who converts back to Judaism and then travels to Tulchin in order to help his Jewish brethren. Minsky represented a generation of Jewish writers who find in Ukrainian history an opportunity to highlight the universality of faith. Around the same time, Minsky wrote optimistically, and this is in his treatise, Pri Svieti Совести, which is this totally bizarre and amazing philosophical religious text. He wrote that, quote, the misunderstanding, I have this up here, the misunderstanding between Jews and Slavs couldn't continue forever. And indeed, there came a time when it was dispelled, and both peoples saw themselves in the light of heroism and love. This happened when the grandchildren of Taras Bulba and Yankel met in university and in literature in the light of knowledge and truth. So Minsky's interest in a Jewish-Slavic spiritual rapprochement helps to explain the hybridity of his own hero, Castro. Although the Cossacks are antagonists in Minsky's play, the Marrano here, Castro, is akin to them in certain very obvious ways. He mirrors them in his strength. He's incredibly strong. He's a kind of representative of that Sephardic myth within Ashkenazi literature, this hero that might come from Spain and save us. And like them, he advocates rising up against the Poles. Minsky, of course, was writing at a time of renewed anti-Polish sentiment. Well, in 1905, Avram Rezin, the Yiddish writer and Bundist, translated Minsky's Russian language play into Yiddish in Warsaw. And in 1919, the Yiddish writer Sholem Asch would write many of the episodes directly from Minsky's play into his own Yiddish novel, Kiddush Hashem. And note that 1919 was another moment of renewed hostility, of renewed pogrom violence. Well, Sholem Asch's retelling of this story goes further in humanizing the Cossacks for a Jewish audience. He, of course, wasn't Ukrainian, but he was writing about Ukraine as a paradigm. His account focuses on acts of individual and collective heroism, the sacredness of collective Jewish prayer, and interestingly, the power of Jewish faith to move the Cossack antagonists. So he further embellishes Minsky's and Hanover's account of Tulchin, devoting several pages to a description of the religious procession leading up to the attempt to convert the Jews. And then he emphasizes the aesthetic mixture of Judaism and Christianity, and I'm quoting here Asch. A choir of church singers, headed by one carrying a banner with a sacred image, a Von mit heilige Bild, graven upon it, followed the priest. The Jews saw neither the Cossack leader Krivonos nor the church procession. They closed their eyes so as not to see the cross and the sacred Christian image, and raised their voices louder as they sang the psalms. The Jewish voices mingled with the church choir, and it was as though the murderer and his victim were together intoning to God a song of praise in the glorious sunlight. So when the Jews ignore Krivonis's appeal to come near the flag and bow down before the cross, in Asch, the Cossack leader is momentarily unable to move. Asch thus suggests that the Cossacks recognize in the Jews elements of their own faith. So I'd like to suggest that aided by translation, various acts of translation and even misinterpretation, produced at key moments of anti-Jewish violence at the turn of the 20th century, this Tulchin episode became an allegory for the relationship between trauma, faith, and self-sacrifice in modern Jewish culture, at a moment when Jewish culture was becoming more ecumenical. At two key moments when finding a version of faith suitable to the modern world was paramount, just after the pogroms of the 1880s in Russia and the pogroms that accompanied World War I outside of Russia, these writers turned Hanover's already mythologized account of Tulchin into a blueprint for a modern text about sacrifice and the crisis of belief. I'd like to turn now to some of the other pogrom texts that are produced in this modernist period. First of all, I wanted to just call your attention quickly to Avram Rezin's Winter Song. Rezin, of course, is the person who would then go on a few years later to translate Minsky's Osada Tulchina into Yiddish, also in Warsaw. This text was sung at Bundist meetings. Huliet, huliet, bei ze Winden, frei beherrscht die Welt, brecht die Zweigen wagt, die Bäume tut, was euch gefällt. So revel, revel, angry winds, take over the world, break the branches, hurl the trees, do just as you please. This is a text he's writing at this moment of struggle between the Bundists and the Zionists. But there's also this moment when anti-Semitic winds seem to be blowing one more time in the Tsarist Empire. So this is an early pogrom text produced in Warsaw. It's difficult to overstate the role of the pogroms in Jewish politics and Jewish literature at the turn of the 20th century. East European Jewish modernism arose and spread in large part because of pogrom violence. And what essentially became the ur text for modern Jewish literature is, of course, Bialik's In the City of Slaughter, Be'ir HaHariga, very much a pogrom text. The 1903 Kishinev pogrom renewed the Jewish community's outrage over East European violence all over the world. And Stephen Zipperstein has recently published a very compelling argument for this in his book about Kishinev. Among the very first modernist Jewish texts was Bialik's City of Slaughter, and this was, of course, written in the immediate wake of the Kishinev pogrom. Bialik describes here the splattered blood and the dried, congealed brains of the dead. He's here simultaneously exalting human victims to the level of liturgy and undermining Jewish prayer through graphic depictions of dead bodies, prophesying the need for a Jewish homeland and giving birth to a modern Jewish national poetry. A lot to do in one poem. He's, of course, writing between Kishinev and Odessa at the time. The poet reproaches Jews for their passivity. Don Miron has called the narrator, at certain moments, half demented. And as Zipperstein has put it, Bialik's In the City of Slaughter was seen as the finest, certainly the most influential Jewish poem written since medieval times. Joseph Klausner, the Hebrew critic, called the poem a greater achievement than the Ecclesiastes. So the modernist pogrom poet was using what Habermas has called recent collective memory to augment and in some cases to replace historical memory. All of a sudden we no longer need to rely upon, let's say, the Khmelnytsky episodes. We are relying instead upon what has just happened. Although I will note that the first edition of In the City of Slaughter was called Maseh Nemirov, right? So this story of Nemirov. All right, so I think the opening lines are very familiar to everyone. Arise and go to the City of Slaughter, enter the courtyards, and so forth. We also have these mounds of trash that become an important image in Bialik's poem. Flee to a yard, observe its mound. Upon the mound lie two, a Jew and his dog. A single axe struck both, and both their blood flows to the pigs and the refuse. So this becomes an important image, an important metaphor for what was taking place at the time throughout the Tsarist Empire. 20th century Yiddish and Hebrew poetry arose as a modern means of making sense of Jewish catastrophe, and supplanting for modernizing Jews a liturgical textual tradition with artistic expressions of ideology, be they Zionist, diaspora nationalist, socialist, or a combination of all of these, which is entirely possible, as we all know. World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution ushered in a period of Yiddish literary experimentation. The East European Yiddish poets of the expressionist Chaliastra group, the gang, including Uritsky Greenberg and Peretz Markish, who had experienced World War I firsthand, sought to represent the chaos of war and violence in language. Seth Wolitz has called Peretz Markish's 1921-22 pogrom poem, The Mound, or Die Kuppe, for example, a dirge, a keynote for the modern era. And this was just a couple of cover images from Die Kuppe, 1921 and 1922. Markish in Die Kuppe, published in the wake of the Ukrainian Civil War, evokes mounds of corpses. He's, of course, drawing upon Bialik's mounds of trash and mounds of corpses that combine Bialik's corpses with Trotsky's own historical detritus, right? The Svalky Historic. Here we have in Markish, I've built you a new ark in the middle of the marketplace, a black mound like a blotch. Seat yourself upon its buxom roof, like an old raven on a dung heap, right? Gleich wie a Lob, an alto, in a Mistkasten. Well, Markish's poem had quickly joined Bialik's as a modern documentation of a pogrom. Markish, of course, would have been aware of Trotsky's Svalky Historie, and he comes to a slightly different conclusion from Bialik, whereas Bialik is admonishing a weakened Jewish community and concluding that everyone needs to flee for the desert. Markish buries the Jew's historical role as market vendor, sadly buries them. It's very much a kina, it's very much a dirge, but buries this and continues to move forward in remaining in the diaspora. These modernist poems about violence were quickly constituting a new kind of Jewish canon, in some cases claiming a place alongside songs that described Khmelnytsky, the Spanish Inquisition, and the Babylonian exile. So in the final stage of this talk, I want to turn to the long 1930s. And this is a period that I'm currently examining in a book project that I hope will be forthcoming soon. It's a moment that I've called the Age of Internationalism. Like Khmelnytsky, this is another elephant in the room in discussions of Ukrainian-Jewish relations, albeit of a different nature. What we witness in this Soviet period is an important moment of solidarity among Soviet ethnic subcultures that was in part mandated from above as part of the Soviet internationalist project. And I'd like to emphasize that what I observed in my studies of the Yiddish internationalist poets was the use of a Soviet trope. This is poetry emphasizing a friendship of nations, right? Some of it's superficial, some of it's mandated, to emphasize a lingering concern about national self-determinacy. So what you end up finding in this moment of official, mandated, it's still a little bit pre-socialist realism, but moving towards this kind of high Stalinist poetry, is between the lines discussions of how important it is to be a nation and to think about national pain. The experience of wounds and the identification of others' wounds became the signs that bound Jewish leftists to non-Jews. And this was especially apparent in Ukraine, where Ukrainian and Yiddish writers lived together. In Kharkiv and Kiev in particular, you have these houses where they're living together. They translated one another. They wrote about each other's national struggles, sometimes as substitutes for their own. Discussions of Ukrainian literature, as well as translations, constituted what Lawrence Venuti has termed a specular process, by which Jewish writers simultaneously bolstered the Soviet internationalist friendship of nations and engaged in a conversation about the limitations of national self-expression. So 2 Soviet journals were published, Soviet Ukrainian Yiddish journals were published in Kharkiv, Rote Welt, right here, and Pralit. Rote Welt was more internationalist, Pralit was more proletarian. And they featured regular translations of Ukrainian as well as discussions of Ukrainian literature. Pralit published an excerpts translated from Volodymyr Karyak's address, for example, to the Second All-Ukrainian Union of Soviet Writers Congress, where Karyak clarifies the need to shift the literary focus from peasants to proletarians. Oops, not it. In Ukrainian literature, Karyak writes, one has always felt the strength in the peasant poetics, poetische stichia. The peasant theme is now being reworked. Okay, so what we end up seeing at this moment is an imperative, a new imperative coming from above that stated that it was fine to talk about national culture, to talk about national pain, and to talk about how to write national poetry, so long as this belonged to another group's nation, to another group's national pain. We see a number of examples of this taking place not only in the Soviet Union, but also outside the Soviet Union, in the United States, for example. And one example that I really like to give is by Halevik, who at the time was still a sympathizer with the Communist Party, although he would fall off shortly after this. This is an excerpt from a Sako Vansetzi year, written for the Yortzeit of Sako Vansetzi, very Jewish tradition, right? The Yortzeit of Sako and Vansetzi, who had been put to death as anarchists in 1927. So he writes, today, like last year, the hangman's feet dance the Charleston the world over. Fuller's bite hasn't even been covered with a scab. Heint is oidi falle, Joran Charlestonen, ibel del dem Taliensvies. Es ist noch a vielen nicht verzeugen geworden mit kein Heitel der fullerischer Bies. Fuller was the judge in Boston who had condemned Sako Vansetzi. He goes on, the same evil from accuser to accuser, the same fist, the same power. We won't forget how the clock's hand dripped with blood. that August night. Derselbe Schlacht, von Kategel zu Kategel, derselbe Furcht, dieselbe Macht, und wir vergessen nicht die Weisers und Säger, wie sie haben getrifft mit Blut in Augustnacht. So what we see here in Leivik is that the Yord side of Sacramensetti, very much a Jewish tradition, is an occasion to admit these Italian anarchists into a Jewish fold. The threat that threatens them is a kategel. And kategel, of course, is a term from the Talmud, it's a term from Jewish law. The kategel comes from Greek. We have this term in kategur na se sanigur, right? The accusing lawyer cannot become the defense attorney. And more recently in Jewish literature, Peretz, in his Bunche the Silent, Bunche Schweig, had at the end had this kategel, who is the one who laughs at Bunche when he himself can't manage to ask for anything more than a loaf of warm bread when he makes it to heaven. So for Leivik, bringing a kategel into his poem about these Italians brings the Italians into a Jewish fold. And we see this happening in a number of different ways. It was possible in the long 1930s in the USSR and outside of the USSR to talk about pain, but again, you had to talk about other people's pain. Yet another example that I wanted to share with you is Esther Shumyacher's account of China, of what was taking place in China. And she published this poem first in the Reute Welt in the Soviet Union. Esther Shumyacher, who was married to Peretz Hirschbein, was living in Crimea at the time, and she was publishing these poems in Reute Welt, but she was publishing poems not only about what she saw in Crimea, but what she had seen during all of these travels that she had been on with her husband before arriving in Crimea. Shumyacher was a Gomid-born Canadian Yiddish poet who had married this famous Yiddish playwright, Peretz Hirschbein, and upon arriving in Crimea, became something of a Soviet Yiddish poet very briefly. So here we have a description of what she had seen in China. And she's writing about China just after the suppressed revolution in Shanghai. So lives swarm into a pile of trash. Whistle a song to me, to the wind and the void. The gutter is home to homeless hands. A piece of body has destroyed hunger. Reusens het Lebensabbergling, meest feifel, liedmeal, in de wind und in Wiest, Reenstock is heim for heimlose hand, Breckele goof wat hunger verlent. Sadness is reproduced on the trash heap. Someone's life is destined to expire. So what I've noticed in these poems of internationalism is a reworking of this very recent pogrom theme. A theme that arose very much in and around Ukraine, gradually in the modernist period. The pogrom theme continues, but rather than focusing on anti-Jewish pogroms, writers began to focus on violence against other minority groups. Yet another example would be Peretz Markish's own use. Oh, and what I wanted to call your attention to is just the fact that we have these keywords, these passwords, as I like to call them, that are pogrom passwords, right? Bergele Mist. We have this Mistbach, or Bergele Mist, this pile, this little mountain of trash, which is an image very much borrowed from Bialik and from Markish. And Markish, of course, borrows his own Bergele Mist for his own later poems about non-Jewish groups. Again, these are programmatic Soviet poems, but they are poems that I believe expresses a concern about nationhood within the Soviet period. So for example, in his Spain, which he wrote at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, I'm again your guest, the honor makes me sad. I haven't kept the oath, the ancient ban hasn't been lifted. In your cemeteries, the blasphemed by the fence are still piled mounds of ash, of old from my past. So, ich bin noch einmal dein Gast, der Stolz ist mir vertreut, ich hab die Schwur nicht verhielt, dem Neder nicht gezeitigt, auf dein Besalmen, von die Lästerer beim Pleut, tlien noch bergelich Asch, von meiner Morde verzeitigt. So this mound becomes a kind of password for Markish. It's a means of speaking about one's own national group while also speaking about another group. And of course, the mound for Peretz Markish refers to his immediate past as well as his distant past. He's writing about his own mound, his own dikupe, his own experience and observation of the pogroms during the Civil War. Markish also at least claimed to come from Spanish stock. There had been a certain Lorenzo Markish. So these mounds from my past also refer to the Spanish Inquisition. We see this taking place in several different instances in the United States. Malka Lee, who was a member of the Prolet Pen organization, the Proletarian Pen Club, wrote in 1932 about a lynching in the South in very similar terms to what we had seen in Yiddish poetry about pogroms. And in this case, she writes about this God's black lamb. And here's just the final part of this poem about a lynching. They led him outside with bare feet and bound hands, his skin burnt by southern sand, his flesh became suddenly oily, his black body sparkled in tears, the woods bent low as if from a knife wound. Go back, God's black lamb tore himself from the rope. Oi zurück, Gottes schwarzer Lamm hat sich gerissen von Strick. And this poem, it seems to me, recapitulates an important theme from the modernist pogrom period, especially developed by people like Uri Tzvi Greenberg, who wrote pogrom poems about, oh dear, I have a little glitch in the PowerPoint, but especially pogrom poems about evoking the image of Jesus, about these Jewish Jesuses. And here, Jesus gets translated from a Jew to an African American in Malka Lee's poem. Well, it wasn't only the communists, it wasn't only Soviet sympathizers who used pogrom references to talk about other violence that they saw around the world. When a series of riots broke out in Palestine in 1929, even Tog, which is a kind of mainstream, lowbrow Yiddish newspaper published in the United States, compares the English colonial minister to Pilyura, right? He doesn't recognize himself in the mirror. Der kennt sich nicht im Spiegel, right? So we have the British who are allowing these horrible things to take place in Palestine. This is before fingers have really been pointed either at Arabs or at Jews in Palestine. The British are another version of Ukrainian pogromists. And finally, and this is a more difficult, a more complicated example, but I wanted to bring it here for you since I find it so interesting. You have occasionally these young Soviet poets, this is Moishe when he was slightly older, but when he was in his 20s, from Minsk, writing in an American communist Yiddish newspaper, the Freiheit, Moishe Taif published this poem called Sing Desert Winds, where he takes Bialik's tropes from in the city of Slaughter and reworks them as a poem about Jewish pogromists against Arabs in Palestine in the late 1920s. So he is attempting to identify past Jewish pain in the Tsarist Empire with present Arab pain in Palestine. And here we have a recapitulation of some of the lines of Bialik in this Yiddish poem against Zionists. Oh, you poor Samsons, consumptive old men of Maccabee, who kneel before the executioner's thresholds, licking a bone of an atrocious bloody meal. Woe to the holy home, a city of slaughter. Woe to the holy resting places, a bloody altar. And the final example I wanted to bring in for you, a couple of you have here already heard me talk about my work on Hofstein and his translations of Shevchenko. This comes out also in translations. It was possible and even necessary to translate other peoples in this long 1930s, this period of internationalism. And a few Yiddish poets did this virtuosically, including David Hofstein. In 1939, Hofstein published a translation of Taras Shevchenko's 1840 anti-Tsarist poem, A Dream, Son. Shevchenko's original, which was written in St. Petersburg, is a harsh indictment of the Tsar's limitations on Ukrainians' rights. And images of the Russian winter reflect the alienation of a marginalized Ukrainian subject. So here we have "Upływajcie, pikietujcie, ja вже не почую, один собі на вік віку зниклу заночую." Right, so this is a kind of literal translation, drink, feast, I'm no longer here, alone for eternity, I'll sleep in the snow. Here is David Hofstein's Yiddish rendering, Freizeit, Huliet, Schickelt, Huliet, ich will schon nicht haben, allein, ich will auf ewig, in Schnee vergliedert werden. So, slightly different from the original, right? Rejoice, carouse, get drunk, carouse, all no longer here, alone forever, I'll grow rigid in the snow. And here we see a recapitulation of, as well, of some of these pogrom themes. We have Reasons, Huliet Beise Winden, which comes out very subtly in this translation of a Ukrainian text in the 1930s for a Jewish audience. So pogrom motifs are brought up both to evoke empathy with the Ukrainian subject of the poem, and perhaps to do a little bit more than that, perhaps also to subtly, through a coded language, talk about the continuation of Jewish suffering within this landscape of the Soviet Union. Hofstein, of course, was also writing about the new Soviet landscape of Ukraine. This is from his poem Ukraine in the 1940s, from smoke and from woe and from ash and from shame. I see you lift your damaged hand. And here he's talking specifically about current disgraces, pain of his Ukrainian neighbors, even discussing a bit of Soviet culpability and perhaps Jewish culpability within these lines. So for Jews writing in the Ukrainian Soviet Union, Ukrainian nationhood became a code for talking about their own national experience, and the Jewish traumas of the past became these passwords for suggesting the possibility of a kind of solidarity with other groups. The experience of past suffering in the Pale, and especially the pain of the pogroms, ended up becoming key words for identifying with the suffering of others. Yiddish poems of internationalism, to some extent, worked to localize the texts that influenced them, be they Ukrainian romantic poems or Hebrew pogrom poems. Anthony Pym has talked about the paradigm of localization as a version of translation, where you will take, for instance, video game from Japan that has sushi in it and localize it to the United States where it has a hamburger in it. And you see something kind of similar going on in these poems, the localization of pain to another group's suffering. So the passwords that Jewish internationalists are employing in this age of internationalism are in a broader sense agents of what Homi Bhabha has called cultural translation, or what I've termed translocation. Bhabha discusses the conditions of the late 20th century migrants, and he presents culture of the post-colonial era as transnational and translational. And if these displacements that led to migrancy render all cultures transnational, then culture itself becomes transnational, thanks to these modes of media and circulation. We see something very similar happening in the 1930s. So what remains to be done? And I'm going to end my talk here. The Gordian knot of Jewish leftism in the 1930s remains unresolved in the 20th century. I chose to end the period that I'm examining with World War II, which of course is the moment when this conference ends as well. But Jewish activists continue to face multiple prejudices, and they struggle to make a case for inclusion in this concept that Kimberly Crenshaw has termed intersectionality. This is intersectionality, of course, is this idea that a person can simultaneously face, let's say, racism and homophobia and sexism, and that this increases either their illegibility or their vulnerability within culture. Michael Rothberg, a really interesting scholar in the United States, has proposed in response to this, from a Jewish perspective, the concept of multi-directional memory. And for Rothberg, multi-directional memory is a kind of optimistic approach to the post-colonial moment and Holocaust studies as two things that might merge. He writes, while still in a nascent state, the comparative study of genocide, and especially of genocide in colonial context and its relationship to the Holocaust, is developing rapidly. And indeed, critical cultural studies often precede paradigm shifts among activists themselves. It's my hope that this study of Jewish literature that attempted to write about the pain of others will help us to continue a conversation about how Jews enter into a conversation about comparative pain. I wanted to end with a few notes for our conversation, for the conference itself. First of all, I wanted to talk about where we might be now in Ukrainian-Jewish literary relations. I'm optimistic. I see a moment happening, particularly since 2014, where particularly Ukrainian language writers are writing about Jewish history. I think often poets become the vanguard for discussions that theorists then later take up. You have, for example, Kianovska, who in her Babu Yar Glosami approaches Babu Yar as a theme for Ukrainians to think about. She attempts to, for herself, reanimate these voices of the murdered from Babu Yar. You, of course, have Boris Kersonsky, a writer from Odessa who I had the pleasure of meeting yesterday, who has written very compellingly about Jewish culture and Jewish memory in Russian and has recently shifted to writing in Ukrainian. And I believe that these shifts mark a moment when Ukrainian and Jewish comparative pain, comparative trauma is something that is in the air, that there's a conversation that can now happen. And when I first started to study these things 20 years ago in graduate school, it was a conversation that people approached with kid gloves. You'd go to conferences and you'd see these panels on like the one moment when a Jew and Ukrainian helped each other out. And I think now we've moved into a moment where trauma is something that people aren't afraid to talk about. My own newer interest is in contemporary uses of Ukrainian history in Jewish culture and vice versa. I'm very interested in seeing how history manifests itself in post-2014 literature and art in this Jewish-Ukrainian nexus. In the period under examination at this conference, I would love to hear more about individual relationships. I personally believe that literary translation studies is one of the keys to understanding relationships between Jews and Ukrainians, so it would be fascinating to see more studies come out of Yiddish writers who are translating Ukrainians, Ukrainian writers who are translating Jews, whether during this period of internationalism or later. There are many, many examples of these. Religious borrowings would be another area for further consideration. There are scholars who work on direct liturgical borrowings between Ukrainians and Jews. Ada Rappaport-Albert is one scholar who comes to mind in very important ways. But how do religious writings in Ukrainian incorporate Jewish culture, even Jewish practice, and vice versa? I would love to see more work come out on the very difficult post-war relationship. How does one examine the pain of the Holocaust together with the pain of the Holodomor? Is it something too big to discuss? And in what way is it not discussed? So again, these elephants in the room are precisely what need to be brought into the room, to my mind. The story of Jewish-Ukrainian relations certainly isn't ending here. I'm very hopeful, particularly because of conferences like these, that conversations will continue to take place. And I think this is in some ways something that's been gradually taking place since the 1990s, but in other ways has perhaps been sped up since the Maidan in 2014. So I'm happy to welcome questions, comments, other thoughts. Thank you very much for your
Thank you so much for your interesting and informative lecture. And so we have very limited time. Just a few questions or comments, and then we immediately move to panel one. So, please, questions.
Thank you for your interesting lecture. I have one question. During the Haskalah period, are the Ukrainian figures really just only decorations, or are they a part of stereotype of a goy in Yiddish literature as a simple alert man? What do you think?
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, decoration is too light a term. I don't think, and this is an argument that people like Don Miron has made this argument that the Ukrainians, the non-Jews, just don't exist, and I differ from that, in that I believe that they don't exist a lot, but where they do exist, it's important, and it's important to pay attention to that. So yes, absolutely, 100%, we have this stereotypical goy. What I think is notable is that they're not usually dangerous. They're usually somewhat benign in the literature that I've observed. That you have these Ukrainian figures, they are stereotypes of the goy, they're representatives of the backward landscape of the shtetl, but they're not aggressors. And I think that that's significant at this point, because for the Maskilim, the enemy to be fought is the religious Jewish community. And so the Ukrainians kind of come in as these like incidental figures, but absolutely, and stereotypes are important. Stereotypes are more than decoration, but they help to add to the larger landscape. So that was what I was getting at, is that they're neither unimportant, right? They do exist, nor are they particularly dangerous figures. They're not the enemy. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions, please, Mariusz.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I had a question concerning these terms that you are using, internationalism, right? Like how can we use this term? Like why not universalism? Why not humanism? Why not interethnic? Because it's like pretty much like loaded, politics.
Very loaded.
Let's say.
Very loaded.
And this was
Yes.
like your
Yes.
right?
Yeah. I use interethnic a lot in the book. And this is a book, I'm calling it provisionally Passwords, Yiddish Poetry in the Age of Internationalism. It is loaded. I don't want to skirt or dodge, again, the elephant in the room, the major problem that I'm bringing up by examining these, which is namely that these were writers that were party aligned. So it's an internationalist moment because it's a moment when these writers bought in, for the most part. They were they were not all cardholders of the Communist Party, but they were all at one point very closely aligned to the party. And I want us to look at that moment of internationalism for its problems, but also for the fact that internationalism was something being discussed. Universalism doesn't work, because it's not about universalism. Universalism was something like what Osh was trying to do, right? Osh was trying to be a good universalist. He loved Catholics. He, hung out with the priests. He wanted everybody to be sort of good and ecumenical and not really worry about nationality. Internationalism was different. It was about interethnicity, and these writers did care about nationality. So I don't think universalism or humanism works in that sense. I think it has to be, interethnic does work, and interethnic is a bit more recent and a bit more benign. But I think I would be whitewashing them to call it interethnic. I'm not ready to do that. I'm holding them accountable while also considering them interesting. So, yeah.
Thank you. Questions? Okay, thank you so much. Thank you
Okay,
again.
thank you.
Thank you.